Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of the Past Your Prime podcast, where one of us has a great voice and the other one is a doctor of physical therapy. Say something, Craig.
I'm Craig, and I also have a great voice.
It's debatable. Nonetheless, we're here today to talk about aging athletes. Couple of quick intros. I have been training and receiving physical therapy from Craig for about 10 years. I'm a professional volleyball player in the Volleyball League of America. Shout out to Phoenix Ascension. How about you, Craig?
I'm not a volleyball player. I am a physical therapist. I own a few gyms and clinics where we try to keep people physically active, living their best life. Alex is obviously one of those people. I do research, looking at different ways to operate a clinic better. Also, I've done things around injury prediction and prevention, kind of a whole grip of stuff. But really, I'm interested in how people hurt themselves and how to get people back to the activity they want to do.
And I am interested in trying to continue to play volleyball at a high level, even though I am well past my prime.
Ooh, it's the name of the podcast. He is absolutely past his prime. So my job is to try to pull him to a higher level of activity. But it's a pretty hard job. My back hurts.
And those things can be difficult with all of the things in life.
Yeah.
I've got 2 children and a job, and it's hard to put all those things together. But you alluded to our topic for the podcast today, which I know you have a unique perspective on. So I'll just go ahead and ask the question, can you prevent injuries?
No. So when we were first talking about this, the idea of injury prevention is something that it gets used a lot. You do this exercise, or you make sure that you drink from this water bottle, or you use some brace, and all of a sudden you're not gonna get hurt. There's just no real strong evidence that we can prevent injuries. And from my own personal experience with running a gym where we really actually try to keep track of people's injuries and prevent them from coming back, it's just almost impossible, and it's led us down a pathway where we don't even try anymore. We that's kind of funny. We kind of try, but more it's about early recognition of a new injury and addressing it immediately. Or if you have a previous injury that starts to come up, getting after it quickly. Those are the things that we found to be way more effective. And I think that's why this topic is so interesting and topical for somebody who wants to keep doing activity. Is injuries the number one reason why you'll stop?
So you can't prevent injuries, but you can manage injuries.
You can definitely manage injuries, and I think actually coming out of it from that thought process is more powerful.
Right.
And there's a whole grip of ways that people talk about preventing injuries. So the number one is doing a movement screen. Have you had any?
Yeah, I've had several movement screenings through you, not through anybody else.
Yeah. So if you're a volleyball player, that one of them they might look at is like the functional movement screen. Right.
Okay.
So it's a battery of tests where you do overhead squat, you do an inline lunge, you do an arm reach behind your back, you do a quadruped position where you reach, and each one of those you get scored from 0 to 3, and then they add all those together, and then after you add them together, if you have a score below a certain amount, it's supposed to increase the risk for you to get hurt. Right?
Okay.
So we did a study on that, and we found that it had no relationship to future injury. Right. So
there in full, you can't prevent injuries.
Well, and that's just one idea, is that the whole idea that a movement test, it's kind of, it makes you think that it would actually work, right? Like if you can't do certain activity or certain movements, you're going to actually not be able to do the sport that you want to do without getting hurt. It's dramatically more complicated than that. Like figuring out what is the number that if you create a cut point is what the term is. So say it's typically out of 21, a 21 would be considered a perfect score. If 14 is the cut point, if you have below, you have like a 13, does that mean you're going to get hurt next time you play volleyball?
Okay.
Right.
And one of the other things we talked about is that like injuries are inevitable.
They are.
I know you had like some unique perspective on, I feel like, ancient history that tells us that we're supposed to get injured, or that injuries are going to happen regardless of what we do.
Yeah. So, I mean, Yeah. So if you look at how the human body developed, we didn't develop to prevent injuries. Like we didn't develop to actually have no pain, no knee injury, no back injury. If you look at how our spine is really mobile, and as you compare us to primates whose spine is basically fused, they don't really get disc injuries. Whereas if you look at humans, you can see through the skeletal record, as our spine got more mobile, we actually started to have more disc injuries. And if you don't have a mobile spine, you can't keep your center of mass over your base of support. So you literally can't maintain your balance. You can't do it effectively while saving calories unless you have that mobility. But with that mobility comes injury. So to me, the perspective is of that you actually can somehow optimize a human body. Like so somebody says, I'm going to optimize everything that you do with the idea that the perfect body exists where you're not going to get hurt is just nonsense.
It's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. And honestly, the more time that you do an activity, you're eventually going to have an injury. And there are, I think most of the studies that have been done that look at like why somebody would get hurt, whether that's a training load issue, which we can go into what that means, or it's an internal factor, like you have a weak muscle, or the way that you produce your jumping motion, or even if you look at, you saw the stuff like the ACL tears with different types of turf.
Oh, I mean, I've heard of it, but
yeah, so there can be these external factors. Yeah, don't use that turf, right? Like so, those things that can reduce it, but there's really strong reasons why. It may even be semantics. I just don't like the term injury prevention. You may be able to reduce the risk for some injuries for some period of time, but if you do the activity, you're going to get hurt. Well, I mean, and there's almost an inlet.
I'm a case study on that.
Yeah. Well, you're good for business.
Yeah, keeping Craig in business through all of my injuries over the year. But I mean, it makes a lot of sense because I've had a calf injury, I've had a shoulder injury, most recently coming off a wrist injury. And although I feel like maybe some of them could have been prevented, I also like that the injury management part of it is important because I didn't have to have surgery for any of those, which outcomes can be very mixed when you have surgery for different injuries. And I was, the body is able to generally heal these things given the right management. So like, how does like strength and conditioning play into injury prevention?
Well, yeah. So to me, there are things that you can look at with strength training where you can become more economical, more efficient with the activity, right? And we can look for maybe things that have been shown to have links to injury, and we can try to correct those. I guess it's that the whole idea, I guess the part that I'm most obsessed with is that you can't actually stop all variations of injury, which maybe people aren't actually saying that. But strength training is a great way where you can obviously improve your performance, but then you can shore up things that will happen from actually doing the activity. So volleyball is the thing I always think of is when you're spiking the ball, you can lose control of your proximal shoulder, like your scapular mechanics and everything. If say that's dysfunctional, you start to hit really hard, you still do the movement, and you actually can't control the force that you're actually creating when you hit the ball.
Right.
And so those types of things you can go after that, but you can also, as like an athlete who as they get older, if you start to notice that your shoulder feels uncomfortable, you can also tape your scapula. Right? Like you can tape your shoulder.
We've done that many times.
Right. Yeah. So you can have things that are training aids that can actually also help manage the load that you're putting through your body. But to go back to the strength training piece, well, yeah, you can do things like scap push-ups to target your serratus anterior. You can do shoulder retractions to get the muscles that retract the shoulder blade. You can do different types of activities that force you to stabilize the scapula. You can also work on doing eccentric control, like so. Throw a ball over your hand and you slow it down. You catch the ball and slow it down. So you'll work the mechanics eccentrically.
Yeah.
But I always think with strength training, the shift as you get older should be things that allow you to keep being physically active with the sport that's the most important. Right. So instead of it being, hey, I'm going to increase my vertical alone, but you can still try to increase your vertical. I'm not going to try to take that from you. But but the idea becomes more, how can I make sure that when I go play volleyball, I can still play volleyball and my body feels good enough to continue to get better.
Take care of the kids the next day.
To take care of the kids the next day. Well, even there too, right? Like, how do you plan for your kid jumping into your arms in some random way and then whittling all the time? I think there's some level of randomness that you can't actually prevent unless you don't have kids.
And as you get older, you want to be able to play with your kids and, get up off the ground or maybe ride a slide or go on the swings or whatever that is. And like, yeah, if you're not at least somewhat physically active, you're probably putting yourself at a higher risk for getting injured.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I do think that there's that's actually a big piece too. I look often when our team looks at, there's really 5 main problems when somebody comes in through the door. You don't know what the tissue is that's hurting you. So that's that they're like in an injured state. Number 2, you don't know how to manage it without a professional helping you or taking some level of medication, right? So it's how do you get the symptoms to be so stable that you can manage whatever problem you're dealing with. The next thing would be, how do you progress your level of activity up to where your tissue can handle it, but your previous exercise history and what you perceive as hard doesn't make you overload your tissue, which is actually what I find to be the most difficult part when somebody's coming out of a rehab state. Is you will have to pull your workouts down to where your tissue handles it well, and it'll feel way easier. It'll feel too easy for you. You'll actually feel like you're not working out hard enough,
But you're loading the tissues or the tendons or muscles or whatever, right?
You've got it. And then our next thing would be, how do you keep doing exercise for a really long period of time without constantly coming back in, getting the injury bug? And that's where our stance is. It's more early recognition of an actual injury. So if you think that there's like an infinite number of factors that could cause somebody to be hurt, I could try to predict. I could try to do all these different tests to hopefully predict it, or I can make sure that it's very easy for you to see me as soon as there's a problem that's emerging. And to me, I find that to be way more effective.
Right.
Because if you think about it, you kind of even talked about it. How often do you ignore feeling crappy?
Probably too much.
Right.
Yeah.
And you almost train your body to be able to feel crappy.
Yeah.
Right. So like when you spike the ball, you probably hit 100 times before 100 times of it hurting, and it progressively gets worse and worse and worse. And your whole time is like, it's going to go away.
Right.
It's going to go away. Or I don't have enough time to go get this checked out.
Yeah.
Like that's more of an issue to me than you didn't do the right injury screening to see your shoulder's going to hurt you in the future.
Well, and what I see is like a lot of people, when they get injured, they just will stop that activity.
Yeah.
And just from personal experience, I tweaked my back like a month ago squatting, broke my wrist like 6 months ago, and I've been rehabbing that with Craig. So I've been trying my best to stay fit while being currently still injured. I've got like a limp wrist over here, but I hurt my back squatting. And the first thing I did was like go back and load my back again, lightly, but load it. And I was able to squat the same amount within like 6 days. And so something where if I probably, and I want your opinion on it, but if I had to just let it go and just rested I probably still would have been just as injured a week later.
Well, it is interesting, right? We call that fake progress. So that's how I think of it. Is oftentimes you take time off and you think that that's what's going to give you a therapeutic effect, but really you just took time off. You're not loading the thing that was hurt. And when you come back to it, you're hoping that it's healed and the thing that caused it to happen is now gone.
Right.
But oftentimes it's not. And so in our book, so for example, like one of the things that you could squat, wear a lumbar brace. That can help to manage the load that's going through your spine and make sure it's not painful, but you're still actually loading everything else.
Right.
I mean, there's good evidence. So while I say you can't prevent injury, right, there are things that you can do that are just make it so you're not blatantly hurting yourself, right? Like I'm not saying you can't prevent if you don't want to hurt your wrist, don't punch a wall type of thing. Like I'm not saying go punch a wall. That's not what I'm saying, right? So there is a thing of have you ever heard anything about called the acute versus chronic workload ratio?
No, but I'm not a doctor.
No. So one of the things, have you ever heard of like the 10% rule about not progressing your training load more than 10%? It's a common one.
I feel like you should have told me these
things. I probably should have said that. So 10% is a common one where if you're talking to a runner, of them not or any endurance athlete, if they're going to increase their amount of running distance, they don't go more than 10% per week. So as a volume increase, right?
That is good to know. I went for a run for the first time in a long time yesterday.
You got to run tomorrow?
Not more than 10%. I was able to do a half mile before coughing up blood. So not real blood, but my calves were on fire.
Yeah. And your calves he has big, magnificent calves.
Thank you.
Yeah. well, partially, one of them's torn.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a sad note.
Right, it's all right. But
Yeah.
I ran a half a mile in I think like 6 minutes. So that's like one of those little boxes on the athletic performance thing that I've just never looked at. And it was like, I need to be able to run. So at least now I know
So
my
you know
limit
you can run.
and I can run, but I can't run more than like a sixth of a mile
Dude.
until next week.
Dude, I don't remember what I was talking about. Oh yeah, so if you think about training load, no, just like what he's saying though. So the idea about training load is that what you've done in the past impacts what you're doing this week. So if you have too big of an increase from what your chronic workout load is, so say you go back to playing volleyball and you have not done any level of preparation, and you jump in and you have 1,000-fold increase from what you were doing before because you were doing nothing.
That's what I did right after COVID.
Right. So that spike, that typically you'll have increased injuries during that time frame.
Yeah.
Right. So if you do some level of preseason and you reduce how big of a jump you're going to have, there's often a reduction in how many injuries we'll see amongst a group of people. We can't predict which ones are going to be the ones to get hurt, which is part of what I'm saying around. In that sense, we can reduce the risk, but there's still going to be people. It doesn't matter if you do that perfectly, you're still going to get hurt.
Well, and I feel like there's so many other factors: your nutrition, hydration, your training load. Are you also an endurance runner and you're running 10 miles and then going to do something? Are you training in the morning and then going to do your activity? Like, I think all of those things can be factors that probably weigh into.
Well, it is, but what's crazy
injury risk.
Well, I also often think that some of the things that we're catching are almost looking at what mechanisms of injury that people experience, right? So
what do you mean by that?
So like if there's some of the seminal studies that have looked at how people get their ACL torn, they do drop tests where somebody drops off a box and they see if their knees dive in and hit each other. Yeah, I mean, I remember I've been
doing a lot of depth jumps, so.
And you keep the knees apart when you land, right?
I do now.
So yeah, I remember we did these tests. We were doing these tests on college team, and when one of the athletes, every time they hit the ground, their knees would smack together audibly, called it a clapper.
Okay.
Which is not, you don't want to be clapping when you land at the bottom. That's not good for your body. And so what's funny is when we talked with her afterwards, she was already in pain.
Basketball athlete?
No, well, actually, I can't remember if it was basketball or volleyball. We did all of the teams.
Okay.
I can't remember if it was which one it was.
Either way,
yeah, but it was
some sort of jumping athlete.
It was definitely a jumping athlete, but I mean, that's kind of the crazy part is she was very skilled at her sport, and she wasn't that she couldn't jump, but she couldn't control the forces that she was producing. But in that specific person, she would have failed the test or been high risk for an injury. She already had an injury.
Oh,
you know what I mean?
Right.
So to me, it's already too far gone. So, so I guess kind of pulling it back to what I was talking about with the training load. If you're looking for somebody who's been training for a long period of time, right? Like, so you've done volleyball for how many years?
I don't know. I'm super old, so more than 20.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah, actually probably like 25, maybe
25 years.
25 years. Yeah.
Okay. So if you think about all of the training stimulus that you've had in that 25 years, it's had an impact on what you perceive as hard. Right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I think is not well recognized is that you're going to be able to push yourself to work harder, even if your body can't handle it. And that's one of those things, like the longer your training history is, the easier it is for you to overreach on the single workout.
Yeah.
And that to me is a classic mistake when people are getting back into the actual sport.
I feel like I've noticed that a lot recently, just since my wrist injury. Like, I'm pushing myself way harder than I have in a long time, partially because I'm not doing anything else and I don't want to lose my athleticism, but I'm probably overreaching a little bit in some of my training, just with my calf still hurting, and I can't do as many things with my wrist. So,
well, it's kind of how you approach off season, though, isn't it?
Right.
So I mean,
yeah,
off season,
because you need that stimulus at the same time. Like, it's probably tough to balance like training stimulus versus just staying healthy, because they're going to counteract each other at some point, where you need to be able to stimulate your muscles, your tendons, and to adapt, or else you're not going to grow, get bigger, get stronger. But trying to do that without getting injured at an older age is just not easy anymore.
It's not easy. And I actually do think that that's actually a really interesting point, though. Is like the more active you become, the more times that you do an activity, the more exposure to that activity, you're more risk for having another injury.
Give me an example.
So say I first start to run, and you can like look at injury based off of how long the amount of exposure you're having to running, right? So you never would have had a running related injury if you never ran, right?
Terrific. Okay.
But if we added 100 hours of running over the next year, you're most likely going to have something that could be classified as an injury. And even there, totally semantics, but what's an injury?
And that's a lot of who you're working with right now.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you do a lot of endurance athletes now.
We do across the board. We have a lot of endurance athletes, but endurance athletes tend to hurt themselves really good. Yeah.
And me as like a team sport athlete, like I just was like, you're just running. Like, how are you going to get injured running? But now I know that it's super common that you're going to have strains and knee injuries and hips and.
Well, how many people on your team do you think during the course of your season are getting hurt?
All of them. Some way, in some way,
There's
even if it's
100% injuries. 100% of the people on the team
are probably managing something, whether it's just a sore shoulder or a sore knee and I don't know if you classify that as an injury or not.
Well, see, I would, because do you think it? So this is funny. So years back, I'd gone through the literature to see what. It's actually probably not interesting to anybody else, right? But what's the operational definition matters of what an injury is, and so in some of our studies, we classified it as time plus seeing a medical professional. But if you think about how often do you have an injury or hurt, I guess, pain, and you don't actually go see somebody.
Not me, but I think a lot of folks do.
Wow. Yeah, and those are all, to me, those are all injuries. So it's whether you see a health professional or not, you're in an injured state. You're not playing
time loss. So time loss equals injury, basically.
Yeah, and I think most individuals, if you do a look or an inventory of how your body feels, you can probably point to something that doesn't quite feel right. Like right now, as I sit here, my upper back is a little bit irritated, or you tweaked your back lightly with the squat. Yeah. That's a state that, to me, that's what I'm saying is our bodies have a kind of fragility to them that's normal. And if you look at the more that you stress it and you don't let your body recover, I think the fragility goes up, and you'll start to catch more of these injuries. But to kind of hit it one more time, I don't think the better you're feeling, the more you're going to play, the more injuries you're going to have.
Right.
Right. And so the fifth thing that I didn't mention, so I said the exercise and making sure people stay exercising, that's another problem. But then the other big one is if you're trying to push your performance, you're by the very nature of pushing it, you're pushing past what your normal tissue capacity is, you're always going to be flirting with injury.
Right. So yeah, that's kind of what I was alluding to.
Yeah. So if you're going to be pushing and you're playing on a pro level, I would say that the whole idea is that you're trying to get performance gains at the risk of feeling crappy.
Right.
And that's normal. And I think that's healthy.
And there's been plenty of times where I get to a fifth set and it's like, I feel like my calf is going to just blow out of my leg right now, but I'm not stopping.
Yeah. That's
how do you feel about Dr. Craig?
That's awesome. That's good for business. That's crazy. Your calf actually it's never exploded.
It did once. I think I called you. Yeah, I called you.
Call me.
I got carried out of a gym because I couldn't walk, and you thought I tore my Achilles, but luckily
it wasn't. Fine. I forgot about that.
You were trying. Get out of
falling.
Here. No, I just put my leg up and I was okay. But
I got texted an image of somebody's foot, like their ankle was fully dislocated.
Oh, gross.
And they could tell they were medicated by this time. And they texted me a photo and they were like, can you help with this? That's like, no. Like, yeah, I think that's surgery. Yeah. So if your foot is actually off your body,
you can't manage all injuries without surgery. I know I mentioned that earlier.
That's not a rehab state. But it's also kind of, so to me, at the end of the day though, the whole idea around preventing injury, to do that, what you have to do is you have to be able to separate a group of people who are at risk from the people who aren't at risk. And they overlap with each other on basically every factor you can look at. So you can have somebody who trains a lot and then had a huge spike of training and they don't get hurt. And then you can also have people who they gradually increased it. There wasn't a huge increase in workload and then they do get hurt.
Right.
And so to
Because
me,
people just have different levels of resiliency.
yeah,
Yeah.
and we're all built to conserve calories, not to prevent injuries, right? So we're built to be injured. That's a deep belief of mine, and I think you can see that across how much money has been poured into the industry of preventing injuries and how crappy the results have been. I mean, if you look at the injury reserve list on any of these professional teams, you would think they would do dramatically better than what they are. And then they'll have a new flavor of the month of this is the next thing that's going to keep these people from getting hurt. And it's always fascinating how that doesn't equate to anything. It doesn't actually help.
Well, and you see how much money these professional athletes are spending, like you said, the resources that are going towards it. I know we talked about maybe your favorite basketball player that spends a lot of money on his body. That's current. He's not the GOAT though.
He's definitely the GOAT. I love LeBron James.
But like, how does like rehab, rest, and recovery play into not preventing injuries?
Well, I mean, so just to say, because we both agree that LeBron James,
we do not.
And the big thing is you can't look at an N of one or like one person who's a total freak in nature and use them as an example for the other us mere mortals. I think he's like the worst example of a person. No one's going to spend $1 million a year unless you're LeBron James. And to be honest, he has an injury or he has a resiliency that's second,
just off the charts.
It's off the charts,
right?
Yeah. So I mean, it's kind of interesting to kind of think of it from that standpoint. What was your questioning?
Like, how does like rest and rehab and all of that kind of play into not preventing injuries?
Yeah, but staying as active as you can be, maximize the amount of training volume you can get in without being set back by something being painful. Yeah. I think the first thing is to realize an injury by itself, like kind of what you alluded to with your team, is that, in my opinion, it doesn't mean you can't train, but you can do things to make it so that the pain doesn't progress. So my 2 cents would be early intervention, or at least early capture when you have something going sideways, and then learning how to use training aids more effectively. So volleyball specifically, the shoulder one is such a simple one. You tape the shoulder, like they do the shoulder strapping tape job, and it stabilizes the scapula, because one of the normal things that happens when you hit really hard is I think you will drive some level of inhibition of some of the muscles around your scapula. And that's a normal response to hitting really hard. And you can use tape to basically make it so that you don't have this progress.
Right.
And then you can still do the activity and it helps. So it's not so much that injury means you have to stop, but it does mean that you should think about tools to make it not get worse, especially during training, and then targeting your strength training after those things that are hurting you. I think that's like, if I had to say that those are two biggest things. In your previous injury history, you should always have a home plan to address any previous injury when it starts to emerge.
Yeah.
Because that's always going to be the thing you're most risk for coming back.
And there were some complicated words in there about the shoulder, but essentially he would just tape the top of my shoulder back so that it stayed in kind of like a loaded position.
Kind of like retracted without depressing.
Okay.
Do they also use words again?
I don't know what those words.
Well, the words are meant to make me sound smart.
Yeah, and they do. You did a good job there. But essentially, it felt like it was keeping my shoulder kind of back to where it wasn't kind of coming forward and creating maybe a more injury-prone position.
We can do a video link too.
Yeah.
And put it below.
We can try that.
Yeah, I'm not sure the technology.
We might not be able to figure that out, but then also just like internal rotation and external rotation exercises for my shoulder specifically were the things that we found were the most effective. Like when I was able to actually do some like decent volume in those exercises, which I feel like most people wouldn't necessarily be able to, do a 30 or 40 pound dumbbell from the floor on an external rotation exercise, as where I had to start with like 3 pounds when I first injured it. But some of those things do, I think, ultimately, like I've never had a shoulder injury since tearing my labrum 6 or 7 years ago. I've had a sore shoulder, but never anything like then when I couldn't even lift my arm above my head, which was probably one of the mobility assessments you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. So how often does it hurt you now?
I mean, I haven't played volleyball in 6 months, so it doesn't hurt at all right now.
How about
great?
How about before that?
I mean, not as bad as my calf. And once again, I think that's like the relative. It's like, which one's the worst right now?
It is interesting that so there's you have recurrent injuries around your calf, your back, and your shoulder. Right. And so those 3 things are I guess we could say they're not fully rehabbed, but I don't think that's actually the issue. Once again, I think it's because you're pushing your edge, you're pushing your performance. And the things that are going to break down are going to be the things that probably broke down because of whatever reason. It could be how you hit, how you sit in your car. It could be almost anything that your overdeveloped monstrous calves. It could be any of those pieces, right? We're not going to Botox your calves though. You know what I mean?
Please don't.
Don't Botox them.
It's my favorite part of my body.
He shaves his legs and he puts cocoa butter on those things. So they are
just all these accusations. I love it.
They're beautiful.
You haven't heard his real voice yet. This is his fake voice. It probably sounds like this.
Come on. So
we're divulging.
Yeah. So no, but I guess that big thing though that I really it's important to understand that it's your injury history. So if you had to say, is there a screen that I would have you do? No, nothing's more important than you owning those three things that you know are going to be the biggest issues for you to stay inactive and really continuing to play volleyball, right? And it's interesting how often people won't do the basics around staying healthy by knowing and mastering the problems, or they just ignore them until they get to a point that it's an issue. That's not injury prevention. That's a completely different problem. You're not owning the thing that's going to stop you from being able to play.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. One of the other things is just like managing specific injuries. That's kind of what we were just talking about. Like, what strategies do you use to manage specific injuries? I feel like every time I come in here, it's just, we're just going to pull on that. So like my wrist most recently, the thing that generally makes it feel better is when I create some separation in a joint. My back, whenever my back hurts, we just kind of pull on my back and my back feels better. When my shoulder was injured, we just kind of pulled on my shoulder and that ended up feeling better.
Well, so those are tractions.
Yeah. I call it pulling on.
Pulling on it. I mean, those are all fine. So it's interesting. I think of it from a standpoint of there's a variety of things that you can use and you can test and see which one the person has the best response to. So for us, I'm not a huge stretching fan, which we can get into later, but
we'll do an episode on that.
On why I hate stretching.
Yeah.
Right. So we have traction, we have soft tissue massage of the muscle, you have activation where you can turn a muscle on, you have inhibition where you turn a muscle off, you can do patterning, things around relative stiffness. But the way I like to really break it down is there's four things that cause something to happen. So you have a local tissue response, you have regional influences, you have things where your nervous system is not running normally, and you have the specific movement. And you can pick any of those. So for you, taping your shoulder helped your shoulder. Right. For your back, traction your back helped your back. It's not like an endless litany of things. It's what's the most effective thing that takes the least amount of time, that then when you do it, you go right back to the activity. That's always my bent. It's not go do 1,000 exercises. I mean, if you're doing 30 to 40 minutes of a thing to make something feel good, you don't really know what's hurting you then.
And I think that's what I like most about your philosophy with your clinics is that, like, I don't want to see you 30 times. I want to see maybe 2 to 3 times, fix you, give you a little bit of homework, and you're not just wasting a bunch of money seeing a physical therapist for 20 visits.
Well, and honestly, you own those tools.
Yeah.
And as an athlete, the more that you're here, the less you're actually getting better at the thing you want to get better at.
Right.
And not only that, long-term success means you actually own the problem. Doesn't matter if I can treat it if you can't make it better, because the moment that's most important for you to be doing your home plan, doing the things that make you feel better, are going to be that when you actually start to feel the worst.
Right.
Like when you're out on the court, like, you're starting to feel it in your back, you have a little break, you self traction, you start to feel it in your shoulder, you have your wife, I guess, tape your shoulder.
Yeah. I feel like for my team, several folks were like, does anybody know how to tape a shoulder? I'm like, yeah, I kind of do.
That's how you broke your wrist.
No.
Okay.
No. I fell on it. I just looked clumsy. We could maybe share that video. And
I bet it was athletic.
I mean, I feel like I jumped pretty high, and that's why I landed so hard. But I don't know, up for debate. Still trying to jump higher. So, any kind of final thoughts? I've got kind of one last question just to try and tie it up. But any thoughts on the injury prevention?
Not really. It's just, you're going to hear a lot of things that are, and I think it's just the newest thing that will tell you this is what you have to do to stay healthy. None of those have that much strength behind them. So to me, the number one thing is know your injury history, and then have a really good plan for those things. And then if you're doing strength training, just remember your off season should be completely around getting your body ready for the next season, getting your body ready for the next performance push. And that anytime you're in that performance phase, you're always flirting with injury. Like it's not something that might happen. It will happen. And if you don't have a good game plan around it, that's when you start to lose playing time, which is what you don't want to do.
Right. All right. So final question is, what's your top advice for aging athletes?
Just give up. Just give up.
No, I should have quit a long time ago, man.
No.
A long time ago.
No, it's just realize, man, that injury and pain are part of what you're going to be dealing with, and realize that the things that you've done in the past that have gotten you there, they've allowed you to push yourself and work at a really high level. That doesn't happen in a vacuum, and so you're actually gonna start to look at exercise and activity in a different way, and what you perceive as hard may be too hard for what the tissue can handle, and just realize as you age, you may need to be more respectful about your body not feeling terrible all the time.
Awesome.
The better it feels, honestly, the faster you can be able to improve your, how well you play. So you don't have to feel like crap all the time.
Well, good. Well, in closing, pastyourprime.com is coming, right?
Yeah. PYP, we're going to have gear. We'll sell a lot of things.
Probably some training. We're thinking about getting some online coaching going through there.
Yeah.
So that's on the horizon. And then if all goes well, we'll have another episode for you guys next week.
Cool. PYP, baby.
PYP, pastyourprime.com. Like, comment, subscribe, share, have your friends share, rate. But if you're going to rate it high. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.